Hello and welcome back everybody, and in this episode I'm going to show you how to do that problem colour of all colours, yellow, using a technique that you might be slightly surprised by.
Well, don't you think this wolfman thing's running a little thin now?
Thin? Looks like a wig to me.
Oh well, I suppose we've made our thematic bed and we'll just have to lay in it. Carry on.
The observant amongst you will have gathered from the introduction that what I'm painting for this yellow demonstration is none other than the Emperor's very own personal brickies, an imperial fist. We've started out by undercoating him with wraithbone for a nice warm tone. Now it's time for the big reveal, and the secret to smooth and easy yellow, it's none other than pink. Pink horror in this particular case, at least to start with anyway. So let's get on with starting to make this marine fabulous. What we're actually doing is creating a zenithal highlight based on pink. We're going to start with the pink horror, and then we're going to move on to fulgrim pink as a lighter colour from above and slightly to the right, and then finally finish off with corax white to really capture that light source from that specific direction. Start with smooth, even layers from below to create the shadows. This technique will work whether you're using a brush, an airbrush like I am, or a sponge, or if you want to slap chop it as well. Those are all viable options for this technique. Just about there on the first layer and ready for the next. Fulgrim pink is going to be the next layer from more or less above but slightly at an angle on the right hand side and from slightly behind the marine. So we'll start to create that perception of a light source being present behind and above him. Maybe a setting sun on an alien planet, or floodlights of some kind, or emergency lighting down a spatial corridor. Who knows? You're free to use your own imagination. My preferred technique for the second layer of a zenithal highlight is, seeing as we're creating the mid-tones, choosing that specific direction I mentioned before, above and slightly behind. I do try and cover a little bit more of the miniature directly from above. Otherwise, your contrasts tend to be a tiny bit too harsh. However, it is completely up to you. This is just my preferred technique. Bear in mind that we are going to be putting another layer and another lighter colour on top of this at the end anyway, so these are just the mid-tones. I'll just spin him round a little bit so that you can see how the shadows are beginning to form, and you can see that it's nice and dark from underneath, and you've got that gradual shade beginning to form from above. Finally, we're going to do the pinpoint of the light source with corax white, and with this we're really going to make that angle from behind and above more acute, really allowing us to dial in that that's the exact direction that the light is coming from. As before, light, thin layers to give it that smooth look, make it look like a natural transition, covering much less of the miniature, and we really are just concentrating on the pinpoint of the light. So I can see here that these are the directions that the light should be coming from: above, as indicated by the red arrow, and from behind and slightly to the right with the green. I'll just apply a few small layers just to touch it up, and then we'll have a look at him and see how he's shaped up. There we go. Lovely and pink. So finally, next step. I'm using my favourite contrast yellow, which is Imperial Fist from Games Workshop, which is very appropriate seeing as that's what we're painting, and this goes through my airbrush absolutely smoothly like butter. I love it. So we'll start above and Exactly the same as every other paint we've done so far. We're going to do it in small, thin layers and see how he shapes up. The creative among you may be tempted to stop right here and create your own successor chapter. The Miami Heat Marauders, perhaps. Famous for exploding disco balls, roller skating into battle, and victory wet t-shirt contests.
Yeah, I'm gonna spray it down, honey.
Oh, where's that guy now?
They could just carry on and paint an Imperial fist. Now, because it is contrast paint, you will just get plain colours to start with, so you will still have to go over the areas that you've already done several times. This will help the contrast paint to achieve what it does naturally, which is to seep into the recesses ever so slightly and apply extra shading on top of the flatter areas in combination with the shadows that you've created yourself using that pink. Also, just as an aside, if you wanted the shading to be much less vibrant and more subtle, you just simply put less pink and more white on when you're doing your zenithal highlight, and this will achieve a more yellow effect. Personally, I like the high contrast between the nice, smooth, bright yellow and the dark, deep oranges that the pink creates. It makes it look like it's in like a sunset that's dimming, gives it a little bit more of a dramatic look. Closer look at our marine now that he's starting to take shape. If you wanted to, you could actually leave him here if you just wanted sort of tabletop quality, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do some extra highlights just to bring him out a little bit and give him a little bit more pop. Very happy with these results so far. Nice and smooth, lovely contrasts there on those shades. Before we add highlights to the edges and raised areas, what we're going to do is add a little bit more depth to the recesses, and we're going to use a reikland shade, which is an ink or a wash, and this is going to be thinned down ever so slightly with Vallejo airbrush medium, although you could just as easily use water. And then what we're going to do is fill in some of the little recesses and deeper areas on the mini, just to beef up some of those darker tones. This will create a little more contrast from those lovely smooth yellow areas. Painting is usually all about creating contrast, to be fair. It's how you make different areas of the miniature stand out from each other. Usually a good idea when selecting colour palettes to have colours that aren't too similar, so you can really make different areas of the miniature stand out, or particular areas such as faces and helmets and things like that that you want to just stand out in comparison to the rest of your model. Although it is worth pointing out that this is just one technique, and as with many things in painting, different effects require different selections. There are no hard set rules when it comes to painting. Whatever works and whatever you like, they're your miniatures, they're your models. Let's just have a quick look at him so that you can see how he's shaped up. It is sometimes tempting with inks or washes to just liberally splash it on all over and hope that it seeps into the recesses. It has its uses, but not in this particular instance, in particular not with a light colour like yellow. We're trying to keep the brush strokes precise, just so that you're getting them in those deep crevices. Time for the first yellow highlight. I'm using demonic yellow, which is an air colour, but it's the same as the usual demonic yellow, just watered down. So it'll go through an airbrush. As you can see on screen now, I've put up Citadel Colours equivalent according to the Dakka colour comparison chart, which is very good for finding out exactly what brands give you the same or at least an extremely similar colour to most paints, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. The brush technique that I'm using here is to score in more or less straight lines, all in one direction. The aim of this is to follow the guide that we've already created using the zenithal highlight, and we're just going to bring out raised areas, really using our imagination as to where the light would fall as it catches the armour from those directions that we chose when we created our zenith. Now this paint is nice and thin, being that it's already thinned down for going through an airbrush, which is good because you can thin it down further if you require, but it means that it's nice for creating several layers and going back over certain areas again and again if you have to, just to emphasise that colour, particularly in the centre of where you've begun to highlight. So as you can see on this second shoulder, the light wouldn't be able to reach over as far, so I've only scored over the edge of the surface where the light would catch that pauldron. And it's the same with the underside of the left leg here. The light would only just be able to creep under and catch that towards the bottom, so we're not going to highlight very much to reflect that. Going to go over a few areas again now. As mentioned before, it's nice thin layers. We want to achieve a smooth finish before we move on to our next highlight. And throughout we're continuing this same brush stroke technique, not quite stippling but very deliberately putting the brush down in exactly the same direction, kind of licking the surface. It's time to put a little bit of bright sheen on the top of that highlight, and we're going to use AK-47's pastel yellow colour, and once again using the Dakka colour chart. This is the equivalent more or less of dawn yellow. So we're going to stick to the same areas but keep a narrower margin. This is quite a big contrast from that last highlight, so we're just going to pick out smaller areas, once again layering up in smooth stroked patterns, trying to keep our brush strokes neat and thin and all in the same direction. Really pick out some of these nice little sharp edges. Like the bits on the knee and the separations in the plates. Once again, we're only going to focus on areas that we could imagine the light will be striking the armour from the angle that we've chosen. colour up some of these a tiny bit more, give them a bit more of a sheen and intensify the brightness to really make it look like a sun glare. So let's have a look at him. I'm fairly happy with that, nice and smooth, there's a nice bright sheen, and of course if you wanted to carry on and go with the pure white there'd be no issue there, but I'm quite happy to stop at this point and then carry on with the rest of the miniature. And just another final look at those nice under orange shadows. So now the yellow's done, let's bring him to life.
Give my creation life!
So we're starting off with a slightly thinned down black Templar contrast paint, fill in some of the dark details like the rifle and parts of the grenade and the back of his knees and joints and just a few other little areas like that. Just nice and even, nice and simple. So we want a slightly off-white colour for the highlights on the black, and I'm going for a deepkin flesh. We're just going to do exactly the same as we did with the highlights for the armour. We're going to pick out some of the edges following the same pattern along where the light falls. You can see tiny bits, nothing too drastic. We can go over them again if we want them a little bit more prominent, just catching the edges. Next up we're going to fill in some of the brown details with a slightly thinned down contrast paint called Cygor brown, which is a nice deep brown with a reddish tint to it. It should offset really nicely with the yellow, and I tend to do this usually with my imperial fists. I do like the way that it pairs with that yellow. It's a nice deep leathery brown. So we're just going to mainly use this for the equivalent of his webbing. So he's got his holster and a few ammo pouches and other bits and bobs there just around his waist, and this usually fits nicely for that. I did actually highlight the edges of the brown just with a little bit more deepkin flesh, although it would appear that I've forgotten to film that, so
Burke.
I'm going to start doing some of the metallic areas now, and we're going to go with leadbelcher as it's a good solid choice. I'm going to finish off the grenade, do the muzzle of the rifle, and a few extra little bits and bats. The magazine, I believe there's some shell casings on the base as well, although I might get them later after I've painted it. This is thinned down ever so slightly as well, as some of the Games Workshop metallics, as nice as they are, can tend to be a little bit thick and globulous, but you don't want them too thin or they don't cover properly. Obviously, while we're doing all these other details, you are going to want to be very careful with your brush strokes to make sure that you're not touching that yellow, as it would be a very difficult colour to try and correct, particularly with the orange shading. It's not impossible, you would be able to find similar colours in the Citadel range or others, but it might be a case of mixing something to try and cover mistakes. They do happen, and it's always worth having a little bit of a contingency. The good thing is that all the highlights are pre-made colours, so if we were to make a slight mistake on those, we could just go over it with the same colours again. The best practice is to aim to be careful. Turn your miniature upside down to any angle that you need to avoid hitting that yellow. Time for a very well known and time honoured technique to help bring out our metallics. We're going to use good old fashioned nuln oil shade just to go into the recesses and all the metallic areas that we've just painted. Don't need to saturate it, just get a light coverage, try and get them into the recesses. Just using a tiny bit of black templar to try and create the end of the bore in the muzzle. Do some edge highlighting using Army Painter's Shining Silver, the equivalent of which, if you're going to use Citadel paints, would probably be Runefang Steel. I quickly realised at this point that I'd actually forgotten to paint the magazine altogether, so I'm going to start with a base of Shining Silver there. It won't make a massive amount of difference once I've put some nuln oil on it and then highlighted it. Time to start painting his flesh. So we'll go with a base of kislev flesh, thin layers, same as everything else, just build it up so that he's got a nice smooth complexion. Looking at this particular miniature, he's already scarred enough, we don't need to add to it by giving him acne. We're going back to that good old fashioned Reikland fleshshade for exactly the same technique as we used for the armour. We're not saturating it. We're just picking out edges that are sunken below the higher ridges of his forehead, and he's actually got quite a prominent scar in the middle of his forehead, so we'll fill that in a little bit more with the Reikland fleshshade to make it more prominent. Now that's dry, we're going to go back to the kislev flesh and we're just going to thinly layer up over the ridges of his brow and head by way of a highlight. Again, if you wanted to, you could add a little bit of white to the kislev flesh and give him further highlights if you needed to, but just for today we're going to leave him as he is. Time to give him an eyeball, and we're going to start with corax white and just go over the eyeball itself very carefully. What you're doing with an eyeball most of the time is you're kind of making a cross, so you'll go horizontally to make the white of the eye, and then in this case we're going to use macragge blue, and we're actually going to go very gently in a vertical line downwards to create the pupil, and then just touch up with white if we need to afterwards, just in case we've not been quite accurate enough with that blue. Every now and then you may need to, if you've slipped, touch up with maybe a tiny bit of Reikland fleshshade or even a little bit of flesh on the cheek or the eyebrow. If you've slipped, these things do happen, it takes practice. We're now going to do the aquila and other red details using a little bit of Blood Angel's red, which is a very striking and high pigmented contrast paint. It's a very nice one. Flesh Terror's red is ever so slightly thicker in my opinion. I really am a fan of the Blood Angel's red though, it goes on lovely. And as before, and in the interest of safety, what we're doing is we're turning the miniature as often as we have to try and find the best angles to avoid touching that yellow with any of the red that we don't want to. Keeping the brush strokes going in the same direction where possible. Just fill in the eye socket, a few touch-ups, and then we're ready for a shade. In this case, Carroburg Crimson shade, if I'm pronouncing that properly. It's a nice sort of ruby red, and we're going to do exactly the same as we have been doing with every other shade. We're only putting it into the necessary areas, we're not saturating it. Now, contrast paints are designed to create their own shades, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with you accentuating them with further inks and washes if you need to. Right, it's time to make a start on the base, and we're going to break the rule that we've been following all the way through it so far, and we're just going to saturate the bottom of this base with a nice basilicum grey, just to start getting that kind of rocky, earthy colour going, and then we'll work on different shades and tones to make it a more realistic mix of colours as we go along. Now I'm going to use another one of my favourite contrast paints, which is Plaguebearer Flesh. I use this for a variety of uses. In this case we're using it to create a kind of mossy mud, especially when combined with nihilakh oxide, which, despite the fact that it's supposed to be used for rust, I find goes nicely on bases and can pass for kind of moss or different shades of foliage, or even just different shades of grey on rocks. This is all a combination and it will come together nicely in the end. Using a little bit of leadbelcher just to go over the discarded shell casings on the floor, and then we're going to dry brush on some more of the deepkin flesh by way of a few highlights, and then we'll put on some nuln oil for shading, and then we're actually going to use some black templars to try and create the basis of a shadow on the bottom of the base. So we're sticking to that exact same angle that we chose for the light at the beginning of the zenith. Everything is flowing in the same direction. So we're going to imagine where the light is coming from above and behind him, and that's going to cause a shadow to cast from his legs and feet and body, darkening certain parts of the base. We're going to use a few layers of rhinox hide just to smooth off and finish the rim of the base. I decided to use a little bit of agrax earthshade just to create a few darker tones on the inside of his armour at the neck, just to create a little bit more contrast and break up that solid yellow around his head area. I'm now beginning to paint the purity seal using some wraithbone, as per usual, just being very careful. Thin layers. Some more leadbelcher, as I've decided that the eye socket needs to have a few more distinct colours to it. So I've decided to make the rim of the eye socket silver. We're going to add some depth to the purity seal by putting a layer of aggaros dunes on it and then letting that dry, and then some nuln oil to add a little bit of depth to those silver details that we've added to his head and eye socket. Now some shining silver to pick out a few tiny little details and give it a bit of a highlight, and some wraithbone to highlight the edges of the purity seal. Now let's use some pure black, which is the equivalent of a Baden black in Games Workshop paints, and a tiny fine detail brush, which I'm going to be using just to put a few pieces of inscriptions on our purity seal, just to give it a nice little bit of extra detail. We're just stippling on what could be construed as words or symbols. It's so tiny nobody will be able to see. We're back to Black Templar again, and what we're going to do is just darken off that shadow underneath him, just to make it a little bit more prominent. I may do this several times, just so that it's obvious that it is meant to be a shadow. Now back to Plaguebearer Flesh, and what we're going to do with this is we're actually going to add a little bit of grime and dirt to the bottom of his feet, and maybe a tiny bit up his legs, just because it's a little bit more realistic. We're going to do exactly the same with this cygor brown here. Tiny, tiny stipples of dirt and debris, just making the way up his heels and boots. And we're finally back to the leadbelcher. I'm just going to bring out those shell casings ever so slightly more, since we've just put a shadow on his base, and then we're just about done, ready for the decals. Now I'm using microset and microsol, which a good friend of mine introduced me to a while ago. I still detest putting on decals, but this has made it a hell of a lot easier. You saturate the area with the micro set, and then you set it with the micro sol. And you know what? I still hate putting on decals, but then again it's probably because this particular set of decals I've been working my way through is ancient and they're probably on the way out. But being a true Yorkshireman, I am not spending money on any more until I've used these up. With the microset microsol, at least they don't split. They still go on like a pig's ear though, I must admit. Mind you, that might be me. Still, we'll muddle our way through them and do the best we can. And then we'll set them finally with a little bit of technical ardcoat so that they don't come off. And there he is, all ready to go and build something for the big golden boss boy. These are all the paints that I've used, and I'll list them all in the description. Hang fire, he's scarping!
A little longer than a few minutes later.